Right.
We had come from the Harappan civilization
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
maybe the Gupta period, and
Right.
we touched upon the civilizations that were formed, the kingdoms that had ruled,
Right.
and um, to some extent the literature that occurred. And I remember that we talked
Right.
about how the history of literature in a way in India and how um, we don't really know about it because no one has been able to decipher the Harappan script.
Correct.
And then we also talked about Vedic uh,
Right.
literature after the Aryans came,
Hmm.
and we talked about the Rig Ved, Samved, Yajurveda, Atharvaved,
Right.
and a bit about um, the Smritis like Manu Smriti.
Right.
These are some things that I remember.
Very good. Very good. Anyone else remembers? He says that we discussed historical background to Indian literature, and one of the reasons why we history is important is because context is important, right? In order to understand anything, context is very important. For example, you may say, "I love you" in a way in which you can express your hatred, right? So words themselves are not so important in comprehension of what is said. It is the context, it's the situation, it's the background to which something is said that it becomes comprehensible. So if you want to understand what Vedic or what Shrutis are or what Smritis are or what is the background to this, then it starts making sense. Otherwise, it just becomes word. So one of the basic challenges for us, right? And these are not resolved things, is that we lack historical information, historical knowledge of the context in which this ancient literary texts were composed. And we start interpreting it on modern lines, which creates a problem for us because something that was said 2500 years ago in a very different historical condition cannot be interpreted simply as if it's being said today, right? And that is one of the basic methodological issues when one starts studying ancient Indian literature and culture, that the historical contextual information is very often missing. For example, look at the two great epics that dominated that dominate, right, Indian cultural scene, and that is the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Now if you look at getting the historical details about when it was composed, who composed it, then it is all shrouded in legends and myths, right? There is hardly historical data concrete about the day of composition that you may find. And so the scholars who have spent their lifetimes studying the historicity of it say that these epics were written somewhere 200 years before Christ to 200 years after Christ. Almost 400-500 साल है वो, right? इन 400-500 साल में कहीं पे लिखी गई है एक साथ. And many scholars believe that these great epics were not written down just like what we do today, but composed over a period of time, right? And people kept adding to it. And so you have multiple versions of these epics. For example, Mahabharata has multiple kind of uh, what is called recension. Recension yani versions. Avrutti ऐसे. So Mahabharata has kind of four important recensions. Then the scholars put them together and identify the common core of it. And this scholarly activity is called textual criticism. Textual criticism. यानी चार आवृत्तियां महाभारत की अवेलेबल है, उनको मिला के उसमें से जो कॉमन बनता है वो ऑथेंटिक महाभारत है. Do you get what I am saying? Right? So it is preparation of what is known as critical edition of Mahabharata. So Mahabharat's critical edition was made very recently. I think in 50s और 60s, 1950s 60s. महाभारत लिखी गई कब? 300 साल क्राइस्ट से पहले से लेके 200 साल क्राइस्ट के बाद. इन 500 सालों में कभी लिखी गई थी वो, वी डोंट नो. पर उसकी क्रिटिकल एडिशन अभी बनी, right? And it was done at Bhandarkar Oriental Institute in Pune. And Ramayana was also had various versions. A critical edition was made in Oriental Institute, Baroda, MS University. So you can see it's a modern kind of format that was made. And it is an activity of rigorous scholarship called textual criticism to come up with critical edition. Now, why I'm saying all this? Because that helps us to understand the ways in which texts exist in culture, right? We are talking of a period where there were manuscript kind of things. These were the what should I say? Bhurjpatra or palm leaves were used to write books on, or metallic tamrapat was used to write books on, right? Because paper is a very late invention. Paper was invented probably in China, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. And it was brought to India by certain Sultan. I think Nizam Shah probably, right? So some of the Islamic rulers brought paper to India. So there was no paper to write on. So these epics were written on Bhurjpatra or Tamrapatra, and they were tied down. And study of this is what is known as history of the book. So book itself is a kind of historical object. We think that book that we hold in our hand has been like this from thousands of years, right? One of the reasons why we keep on revisiting history is to get over with the idea of presentism. Presentism यानी हम ऐसे मान लेते हैं कि ये सब चीजें आज जो हमारे सामने है वो वैसी ही थी हजारों साल से, राइट? प्रिंटिंग प्रेस नहीं था तब किताबें कैसी थी, right? So this is the history of the book, and I think somebody was to make a presentation today on history of the book. Who is it? Somebody said that. Anyway, so when we look at the history of the books, Mahabharata and the Ramayana, then we find that that is the period, and this period is after the collapse of Mauryan Empire. So Mahabharata started being composed after the collapse of Mauryan Empire with the establishment of Shunga dynasty in the north, right? And we looked at the historical context of all this, that the Mahajanapadas, or the 6 major cities, started evolving somewhere in, I think, middle of the 1st century before Christ, means 500, 600 saal before Christ, right? You have a beginning of urbanization in India, which is called the second urbanization. पहला urbanization कौन सा था? तो हड़प्पन civilization was the first civilization, क्योंकि उनमें शहर थे उनके पास, मोहनजोदड़ो और हड़प्पा, ये 2 बहुत बड़े शहर थे. And then after it declined, people forgot all about it till people discovered it in 19 something, right? Only 30-40 years before your father's birth, they may have been discovered. So you can see कि 2000 साल तक किसी को कुछ, 2500 साल तक हड़प्पन सिविलाइजेशन जैसी कोई चीज थी यहाँ पे, वो किसी को पता नहीं, अचानक एक दिन मिल जाता है, right? So you can see how history is not a fixed thing. It is something which is dynamic. हर रोज कोई नई खोज होती है पास्ट के बारे में, और वो हमारा पास्ट को देखने का नजरिया चेंज कर देती है, right? So this is also something that we have to keep in mind, that history is not a fixed thing. right? Because the way it is given to you in your schools and college, you think that history is a fixed uh, information. Bas, khatam ho gaya. But history is very often changes with time. So that is what we discussed. We discussed classification of discourses, right? Does anyone remember? We made a distinction between Shruti, Smruti, Kavya, and Shastra. These are the four most important categories of discourse in Sanskrit. Does anyone remember anything from this? These categories: Shruti, Smruti, Shastra, or Kavya. ये चार डिस्कोर्सेस थे, चार तरह के डिस्कोर्स थे उन पुराने जमाने में. किसी को याद आ रहा है क्या हमने डिस्कस किया? डज एनीवन रिमेंबर? Anyone remembers what are those four categories? Jaswin, how many of you could hear that lecture last time? No one? No one remembers these categories? These are the categories of ancient Indian literature in Sanskrit, right? First, so let me repeat it, right? That's how we end up wasting time. First category is called Shruti, right? And Shruti means something that is heard, something that is heard by the Rishis. Rishis are not saying that. Rishis are the sages, right? Rishis hear these utterances, right? Because these utterances are eternal. They are not produced by an author. They are apurusheya, right? And they are eternal. They are not composed by any meaning. Rishis would hear it and then write it down. And these utterances are the mantras in Vedas. So Shruti composes of Vedic literature, which is apurusheya, right? Nobody has uttered it. Apurusheya means किसी भी पुरुष ने उसको बोला नहीं है. No purush has said it. No person has uttered those words. So they are eternal. They are believed to be eternal. They are transcendental and they are perfect, right? There is no, you cannot find faults with it. These are called the Vedic text. And Vedic text consists of two portions. So Shruti can be subdivided into two. One is mantra part and second is Brahmana part. Mantra part is the chants or the prayers, which are also called suktas, right? And they are collected in four main texts, four main samhitas, right? And those four samhitas are Rigved, Atharvaved, Yajurved, and Samaved. Samaved is largely Rigved, most of the part of Rigved that is sung. So it's about singing. So these are the four samhitas or texts, right, of mantras. Then the other part of Shruti is Brahman, which consists of things like Aranyak, Upanishads, right? Aranyak is the secret knowledge. Upanishad is also something secret. Knowledge that is given in wilderness is Aranyak, and it's a secret knowledge. And what kind of secret knowledge is that? It is about how to perform rituals, and Vedic rituals are called Shraut from Shruti. श्रुति का जिसमें आप इस्तेमाल करते हो उसे श्रौत कहते हैं. श्रौत विधियां यानी अग्नि, ये वो जो यज्ञ करते हैं. यज्ञ इज द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट पार्ट ऑफ Shruti rituals, right? And how to perform these rituals, how to understand them, and what is the metaphysical and philosophical meanings of Vedas, right? So all these philosophical speculations are collected in the later portion of Vedic corpus called the Upanishads, right? So Upanishads is a metaphysical, philosophical a body of text which has this speculations about creation of universe, who am I, what is the meaning of ultimate reality, what is relation between me and the ultimate reality, all right? Is the world that we see real, right, or is it fictional? What is relation between language and the world, right? These were some of the fundamental questions that you found in Shruti literature. So this entire body of literature, 4 texts of mantras and Aranyaks and the Upanishad, is called the Vedic corpus, and it is also called Shruti, right? It is something that has got religious, spiritual significance. The second category of discourse was Smriti, is something that is remembered by human beings, especially the semi-divine human beings who are Rishis. And that consists of Itihasa and Purana. So Itihasa would mean thing that has happened. And Purana also means something that happened in the past. So in that you find Mahabharata, Ramayana, and various kinds of Puranas. So Shruti, Smruti. Smruti is composed by human sages, Rishis, right? And the third category is called Shastras. Shastras are bodies or doctrines which provide guidance and knowledge regarding various aspects of human life, like dharma, like money and wealth, like sex and desire, kama, and moksha. So these were the 4 fundamental purposes of human life according to the Vedic scripture. So Dharma Shastra is one kind of Shastra, and difference between Dharma Shastra and Shruti is very clear. Shruti is not composed by anybody. वो अपुरुषेय है, इटर्नल है, परफेक्ट है. इसमें वेद आते हैं, उपनिषद आते हैं, अरण्यक आते हैं. Difference between Shastra and Smriti is also very clear, right? Ramayana and Mahabharata are called Itihas. They are not mythologies, right? They are histories. And they have a kind of moral to it. But it's not binding upon the person to follow it, right? It's not that you should do what is told in Ramayana and Mahabharata or various kinds of Puranas. But Shastra, like Dharma Shastra, and most famous is the Manu Smriti. करना है आपको. अगर आपने ये किया है तो आपको ये सजा मिलनी चाहिए, right? So Shastras have this binding that you are supposed to follow it, right? You cannot follow Ram because Ram is God. There is a point beyond which you cannot follow Ram. But Shastra is something that has this injunctional aspect, right? Injunction यानी आपको वो it tells you, it lays down the rules of what should be done in life, right? It's also a collection of systematic knowledge about that area of life, like dharma ho ya arth ho ya kam ho. So most famous treatise Shastra on wealth and power is called Artha Shastra by Kautilya, right? Something that we are going to look at. So we are going to look at all these texts, right, when you make these presentations. And finally, you come to uh, the fourth category of discourse, and that is kavya, right? Kavya is that utterance which gives you pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, right? Vakyam rasatmakam kavyam. I don't know how many of you remember this utterance. And kavya is a product of human creator and human life very often, right? And it is meant for aesthetic delight, for pleasure and joy. And there is elaborate theory of this aesthetic pleasure to be found in a shastra called Natya Shastra, which is attributed to Bharat. So, does anyone remember what we discussed about Bharat, Natya Shastra last time? Does anyone remember? We discussed something called Rasa Sutra given by Bharat. So, Natya Shastra is a Shastra of performance theater. So, it consists of whatever knowledge that was available in those time in a systematic manner, systematized knowledge about theater and performance, right? Largely theater. So it was about theater. And the basic question it was trying to address is how to communicate or how to produce this aesthetic pleasure, how to produce this delight that we are talking about. And the term used for that delight was rasa. And rasa has many kinds of meanings like juice or sap or tasting, flavor, or it may also mean chemical like rasayan, right? So these are various meanings of the term rasa, but it's basically a metaphor, right? And it is one of the core principles of Sanskrit poetics, Indian aesthetics, the notion of rasa. So, what is kavya? Kavya is that which gives you rasa, right? And kavya can be drushya and shravya. That means you can see it, right? And the kavya that can be seen is theater and performance. Or shravya is what you hear being recited. So imagine Kalidas reading out his Meghdutam in front of the king, probably Chandragupta II, because he was believed to be part of those Navaratnas of Gupta Empire, right? And that's where we were discussing historical context of it. So the entire court and the king are listening to Kalidas reciting his poem called Meghadut or Kumara Sambhavam and so on. So that kind of text is also called kavya because people hear it, recite it. So it's an example of shravya kavya. While drushya kavya is something that is being performed. So Kalidas has written a play called Abhigyan Shakuntal, story of Shakuntala, right? So that is performed in front of king. So people can see it. So courtiers and the kings could see that play being performed, while they could hear Meghaduta, right? So Meghadutam is an example of Shravya Kavya. So I also told you, if you remember, that Kavya is not to be interpreted as poetry. It's more about poesis, right? And there is no English equivalent to word Kavya. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because there was a call drop that happened. Yeah. Okay. So coming back to what I've been saying, right? So Kavya is not literature. It is any statement, utterance that has got aesthetic value, right? And Rasa Sutra lays down how aesthetic pleasure is produced in a play. And the formula that he can come up, Bharat comes up, is that it is blending, right, of Vibhav, Anubhav, Vyabhichari Bhav, Sanyogat, Rasa Nishpatti, right? So it is Sanyog or coming together of Vibhava, Anubhava, and Vyabhichari Bhava. So, and we discussed that if you remember last time. I'm just revising everything because this is fundamental to our course. If you don't understand this, then you will miss out most of the content of our course, right? So, vibhava is something which gives rise to bhava, and by bhava we translate it as emotions, but it is more like a way of being. Bhava, bhava, hone ka tarika, right? Because emotions is slightly different from, so being depressed is very different from feeling sad, right? So being and it is often bhav is made up of, it has two dimensions. One is sthai bhav, that is stable dominant emotion, and something that is not dominant, that is usually mixed up and is there for short time. It's like moods that come and go, right? So emotion, stable emotion and changing moods. So sthai bhava and vyobhichari bhav was the term that was used. But vyobhichari bhav includes sthai bhav as well, right? So vibhav is something that causes a state of emotion. Anubhav is what follows that state of emotion, and Vyabhichari bhava are mixture of sthai and Vyabhichari bhava. So to give you an example, it would mean something like uh, uh, something gives rise to particular emotion, right? For example, uh, you receive the money that you were waiting for, right? Large sum of money that you were eagerly waiting for. So that situation causes one of your emotions, right? What is your emotion then? It can be joy, it can be excitement, it can be happiness, right? You are waiting for a certain amount, large sum of money to come to you. So that situation is the trigger of that emotion. It is called vibhav, right? It's determinant. And after seeing that this much amount is deposited in your bank account, your expressions and your how you are is anubhava, right? Something that follows a particular emotion. So there may be a smile, or you may be very happy and you may be very excited and call up your friend and have a party or whatever. So these are anubhavas, right? And anubhava is very often communicated through acting or abhinaya, right? Abhinaya is the Sanskrit term for acting. And acting, according to Bharat, is of two kinds. One is verbal acting and one is body language. So verbal acting is called Vachika Abhinaya, and body language part is called Angika Abhinaya. So the actors, when they perform this situation and the reaction to that situation, then in the minds of the audience, it gives rise to rasa, right? So in a play, you are identifying with the protagonist who is very poor, but he is waiting for a large sum of money to that he is going to receive from his dead uncle. Right? There is a will. And once he receives it, he is joyous. So you can experience that joy. Now you have not received $2 million, right? So there is a difference between bhava and rasa. Bhava means actual everyday emotions, and rasa is that fiction, that is a product of representation on the stage in the mind of the audience. And I gave example of horror films, right? Why do people watch horror films? Nobody would like to meet a ghost in a real person, right? But people do go and watch horror films with ghosts and zombies and vampires. Why? Because that gives us pleasure, right? And so bhaya is what you would experience if at night, from your bed, under your bed, a hand crawls out and grabs your hand, right? That is called bhaya. But if that is shown on screen and you experience fear, it is called bhayanaka. So there is a difference between bhaya and bhayanaka. That is fundamental to rasa theory, right? So rasa is bhayanaka, bhav is bhaya, right? So these are the basics of Indian aesthetics that we discussed last time, and I'm repeating it because if you don't understand this, then it's a waste of time doing this course, right? So these are the basics of rasa, right? So fictionalized representation causes rasa, right? So rasa is different from actual uh, emotion, right? So rati is sexual arousal, right? So if you experience sexual arousal, it is called rati. But by watching the actors perform that erotic sexual love, what you get in your mind is called shrungara. So rati is bhava and shrungara is rasa. Bhaya is what we experience. Bhayanaka is rasa, right? That gives that thrill, that gives that pleasure that one derives from watching such thing. And Bharat gives 8 kinds of major bhava. Uh, so Rati and Rati and Bhaya and Raudra, and there's a list, uh, right? There's also Bibhats and Jugupsa. So Bibhats is a rasa, right? Jugupsa is a revulsion that you experience in everyday life. So people like to see repulsive things on screen, disgusting things, right? That is what, or on theater, on stage. That is what Bharat seems to be implying. You can see how complex psychological theory was used in those days to devise uh, aesthetic theory, right? So Bharat's Natya Shastra deals with psychology of aesthetics very often, and he uses the knowledge of psychology that he had at that time, 2000 years uh, from present. Uh, so psychology has undergone a lot of changes. So one of the problems is that we should try to avoid using modern psychological categories to understand ancient psychologies, right? Because there was difference. It was based on the knowledge that was present in those days, right? So this is Rasa Sutra. This is repetition. And from here, we now take a step further, right? And maybe Natya Shastra was written 2 centuries after Christ. We don't know. And that is one of the basic issues with ancient Indian literature and culture, is that historical data is very frugal and lot is left to speculations, right? And Bharat also gives a kind of theory of how theater emerged in India. Theater की शुरुआत कैसे हुई? So he says that it emerged out of combination of Vedic uh, text. From Rigved, it took verbal utterances. From Samved, it took singing. From Yajurved and Atharvaved, it took performance, enacting the rituals, staging it, right? So, taking all these components of music from Samved, poetry from Rigved, and performance from other Ved, it assembled a single practice called theater or Natya. So, this is one of the ancient theories of literature, especially theater. And it took almost 200 years after this text for theory of literature as a written uh, body or written text to emerge. And it emerged under the label of uh, Alankara Shastra, right? Alankara Shastra is the term, is the Shastra of poeticness. How does that sound? It is a science or a discipline of not literature, but poeticness or aesthetic beauty in literature, right? So it is not study of literature per se, but literariness, right? Does that make any sense to anyone when I say that it was not study of literature but literariness? What do you understand by that, this statement? Can anyone tell me? So let me see how smart you are. It is study of literariness, not literature. What do you mean by this statement? Would anyone like to try? No one? Are you awake or are you all sleeping?
Sir, can you please repeat the both the words?
Okay. So it was study of literariness or beauty in literature and not literature per se. And the term used in Sanskrit was Alankara Shastra.
Sir, I am not sure about this, but I
You can
don't know
try.
what literary ness means, but I know what alankars are.
Hmm.
So basically, alankars are used when you want to decorate whatever that you are writing. For example, if मुझे किसी को describe करना है तो if I say that Jatin is a guy, but if I want to like enhance the beauty of it, I'll use alankars and uh, for example, if I say that Upma Alankar hai, so I'll give him like second name like Jashwin, Jatin is handsome like Shahrukh Khan. So that मैं उसको शाहरुख खान जैसी उपमा दे रही हूँ. So it basically enhances the वास्टनेस सॉरी इट मतलब वो जो सेंटेंस है उसको समझने में इजी बना देता है एंड द रीडर और जो भी सुन रहा है दे कैन अंडरस्टैंड इट वेरी इजीली और वो विजुअलाइज कर सकते हैं
Okay.
सो
So what you are saying is that So what does it enhance?
Draw,
Comprehension, or does it enhance beauty?
um, both.
Okay, beauty
मतलब
of what?
beauty of the things that I'm writing, the literature.
Means you are when you compare Jatin with Shah Rukh Khan, is Jatin being decorated, beautified?
Yeah, we can say that. I mean, हाँ ऐसा बोल सकते हैं कि he is being decorated, but वैसे अगर if we see मतलब look at it critically, तो it is also like I am comparing him with Shah Rukh Khan. So, but if we look at it with I don't know what it's called, like fair mind, so we can say that it is basically like मैं उसकी अच्छी तारीफ कर रही हूँ आई गेस मतलब मुझे समझाना नहीं आता
Uh,
बराबर बट
but keep trying. No, that's a good attempt. But see, when I ask you more questions, it is not to show that you are an idiot. But when I ask you question, it means that you are going in a right direction. Take some more steps. और दो तीन कदम चल के देखो, और ज्यादा सोचो उसी के बारे में. इसलिए मैं क्वेश्चन पूछना हूँ, राइट? It's not to show that you are dumb, but to show that you are going in right direction. You need to think further in that direction, right? So I am asking you, what does it beautify? उपमा जो आपने यूज किया, राइट, अलंकार, उससे किस चीज की खूबसूरती बढ़ी, जतिन की या किसी और चीज की?
नहीं जतिन की तो नहीं बट जो मैंने लिखा है दैट बिकम्स मोर अट्रैक्टिव
एग्जैक्टली, एग्जैक्टली. तो आपने जो लिखा उसकी खूबसूरती बढ़ी, राइट?
यस
Right. So you used a figure of speech called simile or upma to beautify
यस
your writing, right?
यस
So the beautiful element in your writing consists of a figure of speech, right?
यस
So Alankara Shastra studies what beautifies language, makes it literature, right? And it was a kind of field of debates, and it saw its pinnacle in Kashmir. So you have something like Kashmiri revolution happening after Bharat. All the great important philosophers of Alankar Shastra were from Kashmir, most of them, right? Rudrat, Kuntak, Udbhat. Uh, then you have Anandavardhan and Abhinav Gupta. So there were some of the most important, Ruyak. Some of them, they were all around a particular geographical territory, right, which we today call Kashmir, right? And this Kashmiri school, if you want to put it that way, focuses on language of literature. And when I say study of literariness, it means they study what constitutes beauty in literature, which makes literature literature. कविता को कविता कौन सी चीज बनाती है, राइट? काव्य को काव्य क्या बनाता है? एंड टू पुट इट इन देयर लैंग्वेज, व्हाट इज द सोल ऑफ काव्य? काव्य का आत्मा क्या है, राइट? And many scholars had divergent positions. There is no single definition of kavya, right? And one is in a very narrow sense of the word kavya, which means alankar, which means abhushan, जो आप चढ़ाते हो शरीर के ऊपर. So metaphor that is used is body and ornaments or jewelry that you add, right? Sharir or alamkar. So one of the debates that went on, and that is a very interesting debate, is whether unadorned body is beautiful, right? जिसके ऊपर अगर आप उपमा या रूपक ये सब अलंकार यूज नहीं करते हो, सिर्फ बोलते हो कुछ चीज, तो क्या वो काव्य बन सकता है, राइट? दैट वाज वन ऑफ द क्वेश्चंस, राइट? and natural use of language, can that be poetic, right? And the metaphor that they are continuing is, can ordinary body which has no cosmetics, no ornaments, be beautiful? So nothing is added to that body, but can that body be considered beautiful, right? Sharir or Atma, right? These are the metaphors. Yeah, Sharir or Abhushan, that is a metaphor. So they are using these metaphors. So language in which there is no ornament or alankar used is called स्वभाव ओक्ति. तो स्वभाव ओक्ति काव्य बन सकता है, हाँ या ना, was a debate of those times. And the belief is, एक स्वभावोक्ति जैसी चीज है जिसके पर आप फिल्टर चढ़ाते हो, जैसे मेकअप करते हो, फिल्टर सिलेक्ट करते हो और फिर इंस्टाग्राम पे आप पोस्ट करते हो, राइट? सो यू हैड टू ऐड समथिंग टू your natural face so that it becomes attractive. In same way, language is natural language. You have to add some cosmetics or ornaments or filters to make it attractive, right? So this was one theory of alankar. Alankar is something that is added to it, and they made a distinction between shabda alankar and artha alankar. Shabda alankar are alankar of sound, जैसे कि एलिटरेशन और राइम्स, जिसे यमक कहते हैं, राइट? सो दीज आर मोस्टली फोनेटिक और acoustic figures of speech. Alliteration or other kind of figure of speech is figure of sense. So figure of sound and figure of sense. Figure of sense was simile, metaphor, अतिशयोक्ति. सिमिली को उपमा कहते हैं, राइट? अतिशयोक्ति यानी exaggeration. So when you compare Jatin with Shah Rukh Khan, it is an upma, but it's also अतिशयोक्ति. Can you say that? यानी exaggeration का तत्व है उसमें. Can you say that? Twisha? One figure of speech is called atishayokti, means you say something in excess. इसका चेहरा चांद जैसा है, तो वो उपमा हुआ, पर वो अतिशयोक्ति भी है, right? It is exaggeration or hyperbole is the English term that you may have studied in your school. Hyperbole. Have you heard of this figure of speech called hyperbole in school, English के syllabus में? Does anyone remember? Okay. So Shabda Alankars are alliteration, rhyme, parallelisms, and then you know what, in India, once they start, they don't stop. So right from Bharat makes a list of 5 figures of speech. Then by the time you reach Jagannath, Pandit Raj Jagannath, you have got dozens and dozens of figures of speech. People start coining new figures of speech, right? So you have a whole list of figures of speech of all kinds. So अप्रस्तुत प्रशंसा यानी जो चीज है ही नहीं उसकी तारीफ करना सामने बगैर बताए, right? And so on and so forth. So there were several kinds of figures of speech, and the idea is that if you add this figure of speech, then you will have beauty. But an opposing position was taken by a very famous theorist, right, called Kuntak, and he says that figures of speech are not externally added to it, to language, but they are internal to language. That means it is part and parcel of poetic speech. It is not added from outside. It is something that is constitutive something that is fundamental to language of literature, right? And he defines it as vakrokti. So vakrokti yani tedi, divergent way of saying something, that is not straight away saying something, but obliquely saying something, right? Saying something in an indirect way. And that is the key, that is the soul of poetry according to Kuntaka, right? So Kuntaka is saying that अलंकार बाहर से चढ़ाए नहीं जाते, अलंकार वो वक्रोक्ति से पैदा होते हैं, और वो कवि व्यापार और क्रिएटिव प्रोसेस के कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट्स हैं, right? It is not something that is added, it is not a kind of toppings, right? It's not what you put on the pizza, but it's the pizza itself, right? So that's a strange debate that happened. So on one hand you have people who talk about Shabdalankar and Arthalankar, like Bhamaha, right? He is the most famous scholar associated with the narrow sense of the word alankar as Shabdalankar and Arthalankar. And the opposite view is that of Kuntaka, who says that it is not an ingredient or ornament that is added from outside, but it is internal to literary language. It is constituent. That is what makes literature literary. Otherwise, it's not literature. Right? So that was the debate. So Vakrokti as constitutive principle of literary language is something that makes literature literary. Right? And this was fairly advanced view of these debates are fairly advanced, because many of the debates of the 20th century about literary language are, you can say, prefigured, or these debates anticipate these debates, right? So in some way it is ahead of its time by 2000 years almost, or 15,000 years before its time. So these were some of the debates around alankara, right? And from this alankar, if we move forward to Kashmiri school of poetics, we reach two very big names of Sanskrit theory, Anandavardhan and Abhinavagupta. Right? They are, and right from the beginning, right from the time of Bhamaha in 7th century to Abhinav in 11th. So you have 500 years of history, right, of Kashmiri poetics. All these theorists of literature tried to base their theory on grammar, on philosophy of interpretation called hermeneutics, and in Sanskrit it is called Mimamsa. Mimamsa was a school in the before Christ, right? Which was a school of interpretation of Vedic text. It is a philosophy or methodology of interpretation, and they often built upon theories of the grammarians, like Panini is very old, before the Janapads started, and Patanjali, who is a very famous grammarian in the time of after Mauryan period. And then the third great grammarian was Bhartuhari. So these three great grammarians, right, Vyakranakar as they were called, and Vyakarana was seen as one of the limbs of Vedic interpretation. वेदांग, राइट, अंग है वेदों का. सो पहले वेद आए और बाद में वेदांग आए. तो उसमें निरुक्ता इज अनदर स्कूल ऑफ इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ वर्ड्स, और यास्क was one of the great scholars associated with Nirukta. So you can see they draw upon knowledge tradition which is ancient, right? Whether it is Bhamaha or Kuntaka, or whether it is Anandavardhana or Abhinava, all these great theorists of literature are drawing upon traditions of Vedic interpretation and Vedic philosophies, right? So, to understand what they are saying, we need to understand a bit about Mimamsa, right, or the school of interpretation. And curiously, one of the debates that was happening in those days was how are words understood, or how do you understand Vedic utterance? For example, somebody chants Gayatri Mantra, right, which is part of Vedic text. How do you understand it? Is it word that produces meaning, or is it the sentence Vakya that produces meaning? Right. So, what should you analyze, words or the entire sentence? Now, this sounds quaint today, right? What is, how do you uh, interpret or understand Vedic utterance? Then, people said, like Mimamsaka, that words have inherent powers, right? And one of the basic power of the word was denotation or dictionary meaning. For example, word cow, and you have that animal in front of you. So that cow indicates that animal. That's the basic meaning of the word cow. But it can have more than that meaning, which is more than that as well, right? For example, when you say somebody is like a cow, right, then you are implying, in Gujarati you use it very often, garib gai che, right? So you are implying that somebody is pious and submissive and calm, like a cow, right? So upma is used. So when figures of speech come into play, the primary meaning of the word cannot remain the same, because you cannot say that that person is a cow. You cannot say that, right? Because it doesn't mean that that person has two long ears and a tail. That's not what you are saying, right? So the primary meaning of the word is not fit, is not, uh, what should I say, is not relevant to this understanding the sentence, she is a cow, right? Because this second sense of the meaning does not fit with the first sense of cow as that animal. What you are saying is that person has some traits of a cow, right? So this is a second power of the word according to the Mimamsakas. So the first power, the basic denotative meaning, is called abhidha, and the second meaning, where you are indicating something, is called lakshana, right? Abhidha and lakshana. And they also went on to say that you understand a particular statement uh, not by adding up all the words in that sentence. For example, I went to Ahmedabad. To understand this statement, you should know the meaning of I went to Ahmedabad, add it up, and that becomes the meaning of the sentence I went to Ahmedabad. I don't know if I am making any sense. These were the debates of Mimamsakas, and they said that addition of all the meanings of individual word does not give you sentence meaning, right? Because sentence meaning is contextual. So when I said, uh, if my friend asked me, why didn't you come yesterday, and I said I went to Ahmedabad, it would mean something else, right? It is not giving information I went to Ahmedabad. It is telling somebody why I did not come, right? So meaning of a sentence is contextual, right? So there is one additional power of language called tatparya. So you have three powers of word. One is abhida, lakshana, and tatparya. And this is where uh, people like Anandvardhana would come in and say that in literature, you have an additional power of word, right? Which he calls vyanjana or suggestion, right? And suggestion would mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? It is not tatparya according to Anandvardhana. It is not uh, lakshana. It is not a metaphor. It is not denotation, right? But a different kind of meaning. So meaning of literary text is different from all other kinds of language use because it relies on suggestion, right? For example, uh, uh, somebody asks you, uh, where is your friend? And you say that your friend is meeting the uh, head office. Is it the head office? Talking to the vice chancellor, right? Now, you know what kind of person the vice chancellor is, and the whole process of going to the office is based on the listener's knowledge, right? It's not based on the words. So if your friend asks you, where is Jaswin? And you say, Jaswin has gone to see the vice chancellor. Now, what does it mean? The meaning of the sentence, he has gone to meet the vice chancellor, depends on your knowledge of the whole process and the background to it, right? And it may suggest many things. In poetry and in literature, Anandvardhan would say that there is one more aspect to literary meaning, that is uh, so literary meaning is essentially different from general use of language. That is what Anandvardhan is saying. And the example that they give is Gangayam Ghosha. Gangayam Ghosha means Ghosha is the hut, Ganga is the river. So where is the hut? Hut is on the river Ganga. Now, when you say hut is on the river Ganga, it does not make any sense, right? Abhida is meaningless. You cannot build huts on the river Ganga, right? It means it is on the bank of river Ganga. So that would become Lakshana. Like, where is Stratford? Then Stratford is on Avon or something on Thames, or Delhi is on Yamuna, Ganga Yamuna Sangam. It doesn't mean that city is on that where those rivers meet. It is on the bank of those rivers, right? So that is the indicative or lakshana. But Anandvardhan would say that Ganga also gives a feeling of purity, calmness, and there is some sort of divinity with associated with the river, right? So when you say that the heart is on Ganga, it also means that you are living in a very spiritually uplifting place. Today it may be polluted, so you may be saying you are unfortunate to have your home on Ganga. But in those days, at least it was clean, right? So there is a suggested meaning that comes with Ganga, right? And that only a sensitive reader can make out, or Sahridaya. And that is Vyanjana. And Vyanjana is also called Dhvani by Anandvardhana. and Abhinav Gupta, right? So dhvani is the suggested aesthetic meaning of a literary text, which is not dependent on specific aspects of language. So what gives rise to literariness is suggested meaning, right? Kavyasya atma dhvani. And it is this dhvani which results in rasa, according to Anandavardhan and Abhinav Gupta, right? So the idea of dhvani is very important part of Sanskrit poetics. And it draws upon traditions of grammar and interpretations of Vedic texts. And this is the last point I will make for today, and we'll stop. And it draws upon a very famous idea used in grammar called sphot. Now, sphot, according to grammarians and philosophers like Patanjali and Bhartuhari, is a very specific idea, right? What they are saying, these grammarians, and remember, Anandavardhan came almost 800, 900 years after Patanjali and Bhartuhari, right? So it's a very ancient tradition of in learning that these people are drawing upon. So what is sphota? According to these grammarians, sphot is transcendental, permanent, eternal word, right? Which is different from transient, everyday word. For example, if I say ka, ma, la, right? So when you hear the word kamal, you are listening to three consonant sounds: ka, ma, la. Now, when I utter the first letter ka and then utter ma, ka disappears, right? It leaves its traces behind. Then when I say la, ma disappears, but it leaves its traces behind. So only when I hear the letter la that you understand the meaning of kamala, right? Kamal. If I just say ka, you would not understand anything. Ma, kama. Kama kya hota hai? Kuch nahi. But when I say kamala, then you understand that it is lotus that is being discussed. So only when the last letter is uttered, suddenly a permanent word explodes, right? And that is called sphot. So kamala that I speak just now is temporary, right? Because when I say ka, it disappears, ma, it disappears, la, it disappears. ये तीन transient letters हैं, right? They are temporary, they are momentary. But when they are uttered, a permanent word called kamar crops up, it explodes. तो उसे स्फोट कहते हैं. So sphot is that permanent letter, permanent word that is produced after the temporary aspects of language are disappear. So temporary aspects of language which we are using right now, sounds, right? Sound was called dhvani, and this is not the meaning in which Anandavardhan is using word dhvani. But nad, or the sound that I produce, is temporary, right? Meaning of, say for example, sausage, right? Sausage. I say word sausage and it disappears, but the meaning explodes as one single thing. So meaning is something that is revealed through dhvani. I'm sorry, sphot, right? It's the unified meaning. it cannot be broken down further. So word kamal can be broken down into kamala, but the sfot, the entire shabd kamal cannot be actually broken down. I don't know if I'm communicating anything, right? And it was compared to Brahma, right? So the whole world is temporary. Only one thing is eternal, and it is Brahma. So Shabda and Brahma are similar. And grammarians like Bhartuhari would say that Shabda Brahma. Shabda is itself Brahma, or ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is something that is eternal. Everything that we experience in life is temporary, right? So there is a analogy between Brahma and this Jagat, or the world that we experience, and Shabda and Nad, right? So this is an analogy that, so there is a metaphysical meaning given to Sfot. So what Anandavardhan is doing, that the source of beauty in a poem is not in its separate parts, right? And a metaphor he gives is that of a girl, beautiful woman. It's not her eye, that eye is not what is called beautiful, or nose or lips or hair, but the entire thing, right? Entire uh, appearance is what is beautiful, right? So that entire appearance is dhvani, right? So uh, the metaphor that Anandvardhan uses, lavanyavati and lavanya. So it's not in a particular part of, so it's not in a particular part of poem or novel or a play that you find source of aesthetics, pleasure, but it's totality, right? Which is transcendental, eternal. That is the source of beauty. And this uh, totality, which is permanent, is called dhvani, right? So dhvani is like sport. So that's the analogy. And you can see how these traditions are used by literary scholars to give literary criticism a philosophical and metaphysical basis, right? So with that very complex discussion, if there is some doubts or queries, you can ask me, because what we are saying is difficult, right? So we discussed alankar and dhvani. Ras, alankar and dhvani, these are most important concepts in Sanskrit poetics. And these theories of literature influence literature. At the same time, literary texts were analyzed and they gave rise to these theories, right? Any doubts, queries you have to about what I have said? Any questions, or is it very clear? Okay, yes, yes. And Jaswin, it's there in the essay by Krishnamurti, K. Krishnamurti, right? On Sanskrit poetics and overview. It's also there in many of the books that I have kept in the group on aestheticians as well as, right? So it's there in the group. You just have to, so that's where you have to look. Anyone else has any query? Okay, so we stop for today. I think Neeti has come bit late. So I think I have to allot you presentation topics, Neeti, before we end. Yes. Neeti and Dhrumi.
Yes, sir.
Have I allotted you topics for presentation, Neeti?
No, sir.
No. So take them. I will give you right away. Okay, your topic is presentation on Arun Kolatkar and Namdev Dasar. Neeti.
Arun.
Arun Kolatkar, I will put it in the chat box.
Okay, sir.
And Namdev Dasar. The texts are given uh, in the group as well as they were emailed to you, right? Okay. What about you, Dhrumi? She has logged in, but she has not responded right from the beginning. Anyway, okay. So we wind up for today and we meet tomorrow at 1 to from 1 to 3 for extra classes, right? Because some of the classes we missed because of some activities that you had like field trip and festival, mental health festival. So we lost out on a couple of classes. So I'm going to take extra classes tomorrow from 1 to 3. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Right. And in case somebody is ready with presentations, we'll have them. Otherwise, we'll have them next week. It's fine if you don't have anyone, but in case you have, if somebody is ready, we'll have it. Okay. So see you tomorrow. And I will put, yeah, it's fine. I want, what's your topic, Udit? Sangam literature, right? I'm going to combine it with Jaswin's, right? And that will take up after we discuss Sanskrit. So Sanskrit के बाद तमिल पे जाएंगे हम, right? So you can keep working on it, but once we finish Sanskrit poetics, we'll take up uh, Sangam literature and Tamil. Yes. Okay. So see you tomorrow then at 1 o'clock. Have a good day. And I will put the link to the recording once I get it and I upload it. Yeah. Thank you.